Carlton Bourne edits the news.
Good evening, everybody. For months past, there has been a contest of wits between the President of the United States and the Washington reporters. They have sought to make him tell what he intends to do about a third term. He has sought, by banter, persiflage, clever answer, smiles, and occasional silence, not to tell him. How long can that battle of wits go on without somebody losing his temper? The President, thus far, has been unusually patient with respect to these persistent inquiries. Perhaps he feels that they are justified by public curiosity and public interest. But, of course, as President, if he wanted to, he could have Steve Early tell the boys, now see here, no more questions about the third term, or we'll cut out the press conferences. However, Franklin D. Roosevelt is clever enough with repartee and easy enough in almost any situation in relation to reporters to be able to continue to handle it. But he had to handle it again today, and it looks as though he would have to continue to handle it at every press conference that will come between now and the time that he makes up his mind to tell what he has already made up his mind about. Today, of course, it was what Mr. Lewis said yesterday that was called to his attention. After all, that was news, that made headlines, that concerned him, that was a matter of legitimate inquiry, and the reporters didn't miss asking the question. His attention was called to what Mr. Lewis said, that he would be defeated ignominiously if he sought a third term. Today, the President addressed the reporter who asked the question rather sternly. He called him Mr. Bones. Mr. Bones is the end man in minstrelsy, who sometimes asks and sometimes answers questions. And he said to him, "Give me one reason why I should comment on matters of this kind." The reporter, unfortunately, was silent. But he could have given a good reason. Perhaps the reporter hadn't heard about it, because the good reason was contained in today's speech by Senator Burton K. Wheeler before the mine workers in Columbus, Ohio. Senator Wheeler says the President's silence on the third term issue is producing chaotic conditions, and if continued, may produce democratic disaster. Now, when a leading Democratic senator, who at the same time is a candidate for the Democratic nomination for president, predicts disaster for the Democratic Party if something isn't done that he thinks ought to be done, why, of course, even Franklin D. Roosevelt would consider that a good reason why he should reply to a certain query. "The longer the situation runs," said Senator Wheeler, "the more chaotic conditions within the party become. It can only lead to disaster if the confusion continues up to the time of the convention." Of course, in fairness, we should add that naturally Mr. Wheeler wants to know soon so that he knows where he stands, because he has said that Mr. Roosevelt could have a third-term nomination if he wanted it. And then he added, any president of the United States can renominate himself if he wants to. The federal government has too large an organization and too much patronage for anyone to overcome it. It has always been true that a president could renominate himself, and the government today is larger than at any time in history. Now, obviously, Mr. Roosevelt would reply that it is his silence that keeps things from becoming chaotic because of the host of candidates that would start fighting in the open immediately if he should announce that he was not a candidate. And, of course, if confusion continues up to the time of the convention, well, that's something else. But it can't. The primary laws will require Franklin D. Roosevelt to make his declaration long before the conventions. What about March 4th, 1940, as a suitable date for the President's declaration of intention? Then he's been in office 7 years. It's a kind of an anniversary. He begins the final months of his administration. perhaps that's the time that he's picked. But can any president of the United States renominate himself? Is Senator Wheeler's statement completely true? Well, perhaps it's true to a certain extent so far as renomination is concerned, although even there he's got to have the support of his party and of his party leaders. And after all, unless they feel that he can be re-elected, even though he has passed out all kinds of favors, that isn't going to make them want to re-elect him unless they feel that he's a man who can be re-elected. So there's that qualification. And then, when it comes to the third term, oh, that's an altogether different story. According to all the polls, a good half, yes, more than half, 55% of the people of the United States oppose the third term, even though a majority of those same people approve President Roosevelt and his administration. But Senator Wheeler has given the situation a strong push, and one wonders whether he has queered himself with the president. Senator Wheeler today said that definitely he doesn't like the third-term president. And definitely he likes what Franklin D. Roosevelt has done. And definitely he would support him if he were renominated. So one wonders just where Senator Wheeler stands. He seems to be in a somewhat unhappy frame of mind. His speech today was definitely liberal and calculated to win the approval of organized labor and the unemployed. It agreed in practically all respects with New Deal policy, except for his emphasis on American isolation. It brought him a rising vote of confidence from the United Mine Workers, and so now Senator Wheeler is definitely on his way as a candidate, and as I've said before, I've heard rather more about him than about certain other candidates who have been more frequently mentioned. Prime Minister Mackenzie King of Canada announced today that Canada's general election probably would be held on either March 18th or 26th. He dissolved Parliament at the end of yesterday's bitter partisan debate, as he had every right to do, and undoubtedly, from his point of view, it was good politics. There was a Liberal Party caucus today. The members endorsed the Prime Minister's action. Mr. King said there wasn't a single discordant note. There was the utmost enthusiasm and the greatest demonstration of loyalty any political leader ever received. Now, the opposition wants to form a national government. The Conservatives recorded their unqualified confidence in Dr. Mannion, their leader at a party caucus, and Mannion promised that if he is elected, there'll be a national government for which the very best brains obtainable among our people are drafted to serve in the cabinet. And he said that Prime Minister King was attempting a most unfair and unsportsmanlike trick in obtaining from the people of Canada a snap decision before they have the opportunity of being advised as to the weaknesses of Mr. King and his government and their unfitness to administer Canada's war effort. Well, one should think that almost 2 months would be plenty of time to tell everybody about whatever weaknesses the King government has. That doesn't look like a snap decision. 2 months of campaigning. It's wartime. And after all, elections perhaps have to be speeded a little in times like these. Dr. Mannion says that the present Canadian administration has been as incompetent in Canada's war effort as they were incompetent in times of peace. And then Mr. King promptly replied. He asks, where are the best brains of Canada? The people have a right to know who are the best minds in the country. He should give the names of this mysterious new ministry. And it looks, according to the anger of the Conservatives, as though they felt that Mr. King had done a smart political thing. President Roosevelt said today that Americans are free to volunteer for service in foreign armies without loss of citizenship, provided they take no oath of allegiance to the belligerent power. Obviously, that concerns those Americans who were reported this morning as having volunteered as aviators in Finland and who have reached Finland to serve. And what the President said today seems to contradict certain things that were said at the time that Americans left to serve in the armies of Spain. Now, the President points out that while foreign nations are prohibited from campaigning for enlistment in the United States, there is nothing in the law to prevent Americans from inquiring, for example, at the Finnish legation with regard to service with the Finnish army. Well, that sounds almost like a hint. But here's a question. Can such Americans go abroad without passports? Passports are now issued, we are told, only to those Americans who satisfy the State Department that they have an excellent reason to go abroad. Now, suppose two men applied to the State Department for a passport to go abroad. One to fight for Finland, one to fight for Germany. What would the State Department do? That's one of those questions that I don't propose to try and answer. Influential United States senators tonight are urging that we proceed cautiously with respect to what we do about Japan. The State Department is proceeding cautiously. The lapsing of the treaty is far more important to Japan than to us. We can reduce the sale of war materials to Japan step by step by the mere extension of the moral embargo. And this may be a more effective procedure than to apply a general embargo at once. Senator Hatch of New Mexico today said he's in favor of arming the State Department with authority to deal with both Japanese exports and imports. Such power would enable our State Department to control such imports from Japan as silk. And silk is Japan's largest single export. And the United States is Japan's only silk customer. With such authority, we wouldn't need an embargo. Action by the State Department would suffice. Good night.
8:55 Eastern Time, when Columbia and its affiliated stations bring you Elma Davis and the news.
Among all the commemorations of Lincoln's birthday, perhaps the most appropriate was that of the Supreme Court, which re-emphasized the protection of the Bill of Rights in setting aside the convictions of 4 Florida Negroes sentenced to death for murder. They claimed that their confessions had been obtained by beating. Justice Black of Alabama, reading a unanimous opinion, said that, I quote, "The courts stand as havens of refuge for those who might otherwise suffer because they are helpless, weak, outnumbered, or nonconforming victims of prejudice and public excitement. No higher duty, no more solemn responsibility rests upon this court than that of translating into living law and maintaining this constitutional shield, deliberately planned and contrived for the benefit of every human being subject to our Constitution of whatever race, creed, or persuasion," end quote. Perhaps in response to President Roosevelt's criticism of Russia before the Youth Congress on Saturday, the Russian papers broke out today in a unanimous attack on America, though their criticisms were aimed not at Mr. Roosevelt, but at Vice President Garner, Congressman Dyes, and various private citizens. They repeated the argument that American capitalists are fattening on war trade, and one of them said that Undersecretary of State Wells, on his approaching trip to Europe, would be the traveling salesman of American imperialism, preparing the way for American entry into the war. While all Central Europe appears to be almost paralyzed by a cold wave that promises to be the worst in 100 years, the war still goes on in Finland, with the Red Army attacking the Mannerheim line today in great force at 3 points. The assault in the Summa sector, described by our correspondent Mr. Hartrich as the keystone of the line, continued for its 12th consecutive day under cover of terrific artillery fire and bombing raids. But at the same time, Russian forces moving on the ice of Lake Ladoga and of the Gulf of Finland attempted to turn both flanks of the line. These attacks also were made in heavy force and supported by a long artillery barrage, but the Finns claim that they have all been repulsed and that 72 tanks were destroyed in the day's fighting. The neutrals suffered all the ship losses today. 1 Swedish and 1 Estonian freighter sunk, both by torpedoes. The crew of the Estonian ship was rescued by a Swedish collier, which was machine-gunned by German planes but escaped. And another British trawler is reported sunk in last Saturday's air attack. Germany and Russia today signed a trade treaty which, according to German expectations, as reported by Russell Hill from Berlin earlier this evening, will compensate for all the commerce Germany has lost by the blockade. Russian transportation will have to improve considerably before this hope is realized. The Germans will trade machinery and metal goods for oil, ore, and fodder, And one of the clauses provides that Germany will set up in Russia an oil refinery and a synthetic rubber factory and will teach the Russians how to run them. A contingent of Australian and New Zealand troops of unknown but apparently considerable size arrived in Egypt today, and according to most reports is expected to strengthen the forces the Allies are keeping in the Near East in case of possible German or Russian attack this spring. It's possible, however, that these troops may eventually come to the Western Front, as their kinsmen did in the last war. This cold wave, freezing most of the inundated areas in the Netherlands clear to the bottom, would make an attack on that country easier if the Germans are contemplating it. In Japan, the 2600th anniversary of the legendary founding of the empire was celebrated by the emperor with a rescript to his subjects in general language, which did not, as some reports had forecast, put the imperial authority formally behind the present Chinese policy. General Hotta, the war minister, admitted in the Diet today that the so-called China incident is likely to continue for years, and the tone of Japanese news stories from southeastern China bears him out. A week ago, these stories spoke of 150,000 Chinese troops encircled and trapped in the mountains. But instead of reporting the capture of this immense force, the Japanese dispatches now say that Japanese troops have abandoned captured positions and returned to their bases, letting the trapped Chinese go, it appears. It is now believed that the new Japanese-controlled Chinese government of Wang Qingwei will be proclaimed near the end of this month. It has been put off again and again since December. And General Hotta said today that to meet the labor shortage in Japan, the Army might, following Hitler's precedent with the Poles, import Chinese prisoners of war to do the work. Japan gave notice today that its treaty of arbitration and conciliation with the Netherlands would be terminated, but said there was no political motive and emphasized friendship for the Dutch.
This is the Columbia Broadcasting System.
Elmer Davis and the news.
The recent report from Paris that the Allies are contemplating an attempt at the encirclement of Russia by attacks from the north and south found support in various pieces of evidence today. Reports from the Arctic Ocean seem to make it fairly clear that a British squadron is watching the Russians and the German ships who have taken refuge with them at Petsamo and Murmansk. Leslie Hoare-Belisha, the lately displaced British war minister, told his constituents at Devonport that the Allies could shorten the war by well-planned, adequate, and decisive action to help Finland, but that any half-hearted intervention would be abortive from the start. The risk of helping Finland might be great, he said, but the risk in not helping might be greater. As once Finland fell, he argued, Germany and Russia together would be able to dominate Scandinavia. This argument seems well-reasoned, but even if, as has been suggested in some quarters, the speech was made with the approval of the British government to test public sentiment, it's a question whether it is not now too late to send the Finns help in the quantity that they need, especially if the Swedes and Norwegians, under German pressure, still refuse to allow Allied troops and war materials to cross their territory. We have no late news from the front in Finland, but earlier today the Finns maintained, without contradiction from Moscow, that they were still holding the line some 6 or 7 miles from Viipuri. Today's attack seemed to have been chiefly between two lakes in the middle of the Karelian Isthmus, where the Finns say the Russians were thrown back with heavy loss. And the Finns insist that they still hold the coastal fortress of Koivisto, whose guns are pounding the attacking forces in the flank and rear. The official Russian news agency TASS denied that Russian planes bombed the Swedish town of Pajala on Wednesday. He even denied that any Russian planes had ever flown over Swedish territory at all. And an attempt was made by implication to represent the whole story as a British invention. The Swedish government, however, which is in no doubt either that Pajala was bombed or as to who bombed it, continues to press its protest in Moscow. Tomorrow, the foreign ministers of Norway, Sweden, and Denmark meet in Copenhagen. And to their originally announced topic of the German submarine war against neutral shipping, they will now probably add discussion of the Finnish situation and of the more vigorous British policy, of which the Altmark case was the first example, but will probably not be the last. Russian newspapers, celebrating the anniversary of the establishment of the Red Army, took notice of the talk of an Allied offensive against Russia with a warning that if anything of the sort happened, they would make a counteroffensive into enemy territory. So far as the Army goes, this doesn't seem a very serious threat in view of what has happened in Finland. But there was also talk of possible Russian naval action in the Pacific, and that might do a good deal of damage to British seaborne trade. In the Near East, nobody is quite sure yet who's going to line up on which side if war comes. The Romanians are mobilizing, and they were sending forces to their Hungarian border. But it has just now been announced in Bucharest that the Romanian and Hungarian governments have reached agreement to cease all press attacks against each other and the tension between the two countries over their territorial dispute appears to have relaxed considerably. All telephone communication between Turkey and Europe was cut off tonight. While this may conceivably mean another earthquake, it might also suggest that a censorship is being clamped on while the government takes some sort of action. A broadcast from our correspondent Cecil Brown in Rome tonight called attention to the decisive factor in all these moves in the Near East. Mr. Brown quoted the Italian newspaper Corriere della Sera as saying that all these British and French plans would collapse if the Mediterranean were blocked in the vicinity of Sicily, or if hostile warships were operating from the Dodecanesus, the group of islands off the Turkish coast which has been held by the Italians since the War of 1911. It must be quite as clear to the British and French as to the Italians that this would be very dangerous to attempt operations in the Near East without at least the benevolent neutrality of Italy. But we've had no news yet about whatever diplomatic moves may be going on in Rome, except that the Italian liner Rex, which carries Under-Secretary of State Sumner Welles and Ambassador Myron Taylor, was passed through Gibraltar in what seems to be the record time of 3 hours and 40 minutes. The House of Representatives tonight passed the bill extending for 3 years the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act, which now goes up to the Senate. The vote on final passage was 216 to 168, with 5 Republicans and 1 Laborite joining the Democrats in voting for it, and 19 Democrats, 1 Progressive, and 1 Farmer Laborite joining the Republicans against it.
This is the Columbia Broadcasting System.
Columbia and its affiliated stations bring you Elma Davis and the news.
With the British and French parliaments reconvening day after tomorrow, it was again reported in London today that their governments would present them with a definite policy for stopping the imports of iron ore from into Germany from Scandinavia, even though that means what is called in London a technical infringement of Norwegian waters. A note to be sent to Norway and Sweden is said to be in preparation, in which the Altmark case and the movements of other German ships will be cited as evidence that Germany has been violating Scandinavian neutrality, and it will be argued that in the face of this, the Allies cannot be expected to remain passive. This as yet is not official, but there's been such persistent talk about it, including the remarks addressed to the neutrals generally by Winston Churchill yesterday, that it looks as if something may really be done. Today's Berlin papers say the neutrals must now expect England and France to attack them with force. It seems very doubtful if any such thing is contemplated. But if the Norwegians should resist by force what the British call a technical infringement of neutrality, the Allies would have either to take action which would disastrously damage their moral standing in the eyes of the world, or else back down and look ridiculous. The British argument, of course, is that an intrusion into Norwegian waters to seize German ships is a much less serious violation of neutrality than the German attacks which have sunk almost 100 Norwegian ships and killed about 400 seamen, and that if one is not resisted, the other should not be either. A good many Norwegians see the point in that, but they've been warned by the German press that if they fail to resist attacks on German ships in their waters, the Germans may have to take action. So apparently if this policy is once started, Norway is in danger of becoming a battleground, if not being drawn into the war itself. The territory Finland ceded to Russia in the peace treaty was today formally incorporated in the Soviet Karelian Republic, one of the subdivisions of the Soviet Union, which will hereafter be known as the Karelo-Finnish Republic. It was admitted at the meeting of the Soviet Supreme Council that some of the districts annexed were purely Finnish. When the Swedish Parliament meets tomorrow, Foreign Minister Günther is expected to announce that the project for a defensive alliance of Finland, Sweden, and Norway, which Russia vetoed, has been dropped. Meanwhile, the Swedes are rushing defensive preparations and rejuvenating their high command. The Russian Premier Molotov's speech the other day virtually admitted that the war with Finland had been a preventive war, and the Swedes can't tell when the Russians may again decide that they have to prevent something. If there should be fighting in Norway, that decision might come very soon. Argument still goes on over the authenticity of the documents in the German White Book, accusing Ambassador Bullitt of being the architect of the Anglo-Polish alliance and the maker of the war. American correspondents in Berlin were shown what the Germans said were the original documents, the reports of Polish ambassadors about the activity of Bullitt and other American diplomats. Some thought they looked authentic, some not. The Poles still insist that all their Foreign Office records were destroyed or removed beyond enemy reach, and point out that some of the language ascribed to both American and Polish diplomats is typical Nazi phraseology which it is impossible to imagine a foreigner using. Senator Holt of West Virginia, who was quoted the first day as frankly saying that he believed Bullitt said what was ascribed to him, later amended his statement to say that it sounded very much like him. Naturally, Mr. Bullitt's ideas on European politics in general are pretty well known, and the Germans would not have pinned this story on an American who was pro-Nazi. Some of the general remarks ascribed to Bullitt and other American diplomats are the sort of thing they might have said in a discussion of European political prospects, whether they ever did or not. But a good deal of what they are supposed to have said is quite as implausible as what they are supposed to have done. The Chinese government in Chongqing, the real one, is naturally delighted with the refusal of the United States to recognize the government set up yesterday by the Japanese in Nanking under Wang Qingwei, and they hope that our attitude will make the Japanese army realize the futility of trying to carry out its plans. But Japanese officials said they were not surprised at the refusal of recognition and that they would go right on carrying out their plans. And a notice comes from Mexico City that hereafter no European capitalists will be permitted to enter Mexico. Since the outbreak of the war, European tourists and students have been barred, but capitalists were let in if they were willing to invest $15,000 apiece in Mexican industry. Unfortunately, once they got in, they all treated Mexico as a way station and tried to cross the border into the United States.
This is the Columbia Broadcasting System. 8:55 Eastern Time, and Columbia and its affiliated stations bring you Elma Davis and the news.
The Emperor of Japan today appointed General Abe, the former Prime Minister, whose special ambassador to the new government the Japanese had set up in China, as his personal representative with supreme authority over the Japanese military and naval forces in the occupied area. And, of course, in fact, if not in theory, supreme authority over Wang Qingwei's government as well. Dispatches from Tokyo say that this means that the period of army control in China has ended, and that irresponsible treatment both of Chinese and foreigners will be ended too. But it also means that the prestige of the imperial throne has been put behind the policy of establishing the new order in East Asia, including the dummy government in China. And thus, according to Japanese constitutional and religious theory, that policy is irreversible and cannot be allowed to fail. Forecasts of the Japanese program say that northern China and Inner Mongolia, nominally under control of Wang Qingwei, will actually be governed by Japanese or their Chinese agents, and that in central China, Wang will have, as the dispatches put it, virtually complete independence so long as he cooperates with Japan. Military operations against the real Chinese government are to be continued, and it's admitted in Tokyo that it may be many years before Chinese resistance is broken. But in the meantime, a vigorous effort is to be made to conciliate foreign powers in the hope that they will lend Dr. Wang's government some money. Especially an attempt will be made to treat Americans well, in pursuance of the Japanese theory that this government and people merely misunderstand Japan's ideals. Whatever may be the success of this policy, the Japanese seem to have a good chance of making friends with the British, at least until this war is over. The recent remark of the British ambassador that Japan and Britain were ultimately striving for the same objective was underlined today by the London Times, which often served as a mouthpiece for the British government in the old appeasement days. Now it describes the Japanese invasion of China and the attempt to set up a phony government in the occupied areas as Japan's great experiment. However, there must be men in Japan who suspect that this form of appeasement may not last long if England wins the war. Meanwhile, a British spokesman said that the Allies had no intention of attempting to land troops in Scandinavia or to police Scandinavian waters. So apparently the London and Paris governments have realized the unwisdom of aggression against neutral Norway to cut off the shipments of iron ore, which within a few weeks Germany will be able to get direct from Sweden through the safe waters of the Baltic. The Germans threaten countermeasures if the British interfere with their trade through Norwegian waters, but it would probably be found in practice that it would be easier for either country to put pressure on Norway than on the enemy. British broadcasts today had a good deal to say about the possibility of hampering Germany's overland imports from the Balkans and the Danube Valley. Offhand, it is hard to see how they could do it, but a German comment possibly gives the answer that, I quote, "The British cannot hope to empty the Balkans like a bucket with panicky purchases, often of useless things," end quote. In this competition for Balkan exports, it's a safe bet that neither side is loading itself up with useless things. Our London correspondent, Mr. Morrow, spoke tonight of the combination of optimism and impatience prevalent in England, but so far it does not seem strong enough to push the government into reckless measures. Representative Hamilton Fish today introduced a resolution calling for an investigation of the German White Book charges and said that if upon investigation the facts warrant impeachment of any ambassador or even of the president, the House should act. Mr. Fish said he could not conceive that the German Foreign Ministry would forge or fabricate documents. His remarks were, of course, extensively quoted in Berlin. Senator Reynolds of North Carolina is worried about the movements of Mr. Sumner Welles. He said he wants to know where Mr. Welles went, with whom he talked, and what was done. The newspaper files could answer his first two questions for him, and we have no evidence so far that anything was done. Senator Wheeler of Montana, speaking today to the Commonwealth Club of San Francisco, where Mr. Roosevelt made about the only speech of his 1932 campaign that foreshadowed the New Deal, Senator Wheeler said he did not believe the president wanted or would take another nomination. Speaking for himself, Mr. Wheeler said that if the party felt he could come near winning, he would take a nomination, but that he wasn't campaigning for it and would rather be a senator than vice president. And John L. Lewis said that unless the Democrats nominated a candidate and adopted a platform satisfactory to labor, there'd be another convention.
This is the Columbia Broadcasting System.
It was about dawn this morning that the first reports came in saying that German troops were crossing the frontier into Denmark. At the same time, attacks were being delivered from the sea on a number of Norway's biggest ports. The Oslo radio is still working and has announced that German troops have disembarked at Egersund on the south coast of Norway and that Kristiansand has been attacked and also bombed.
8:55 Eastern Daylight Time, and Columbia and its affiliated stations bring you Elmer Davis and the news.
At the end of the most successful day in the German invasion of Norway, it seems probable that the Germans hold the railroad junction at Dombås, strategic center of the campaign south of Trondheim. A British War Office communique issued at midnight London time says the British resisted any further enemy advances in the Dombås area. It seems likely that they would have denied German claims of the capture of the town if they had been able. It was added, however, that new landings of Allied troops had been made, and this was taken in London as a denial of reports current there during the day that evacuation of all southern Norway was contemplated. The German victory was accomplished when the more northerly of the two flanking columns striking over from the Öster Valley made contact this morning with a force that had pushed southward from Trondheim. They met at Ulsberg on the railroad between Sturren and Dombås and then pushed southward, while at the same time the German force operating in the Gudbrands Valley broke through the Allies at Quam and pushed on for nearly 30 miles. This very rapid advance was obviously made by a motorized column, and it is just possible that Allied reinforcements may come up in time to throw back weak German advanced forces. But the Germans seem to have been strong enough to push through today against what they admit was tough British opposition. It is not certain whether Sturren has yet been taken or not, but the British and Norwegian forces there are certainly surrounded. Until this town falls, the Germans, while they have established contact between southern and central Norway, can't use the easiest route. But Chancellor Hitler's order of the day to the German army said they had conclusively nullified the Allied attempts to beat Germany to her knees. Elsewhere in Norway, there wasn't much fighting. Some action at Narvik with indeterminate results, and outpost actions north of Steinkjer in which the German advanced forces were thrown back. The British admitted the probable loss of 2 submarines. The Germans claim they sank more than that, and also refer to 6 other ships, perhaps transports, sunk by their bombing planes. But this report, made this morning, may be a duplication of yesterday's story. How much truth there is in these figures from the two sides will probably not be known till the war is over, if then. The British again raided the Oslo airport and obviously have a constantly increasing air force in Norway, but the Germans still have a bigger one. Today they made 6 raids on the British landing base at Namsos despite anti-aircraft fire, wrecking a destroyer and inflicting heavy loss of life. This according to dispatches from Namsos itself. Today's reverses stirred an angry popular reaction in Britain, especially after Prime Minister Chamberlain and War Minister Stanley, questioned in Parliament, said that it was not in the public interest to make a statement about the military situation. Sir Archibald Sinclair, leader of the Liberal Party, speaking at Edinburgh, criticized what he called the false prophets who tell us that Hitler missed the bus. He also referred to suspicions that the expeditionary force concentrated to go to the help of Finland had been dispersed before the Germans invaded Norway and had to be reassembled. And he added, I quote, "If the government have muddled this campaign, it will be for Parliament to act objectively, fearlessly, and resolutely in a grand inquest of the nation," end quote. Yet opinion in London seems to be that the Chamberlain ministry will probably survive even these setbacks. At any rate, the British government is preparing for the possibility of having to take on Italy, too. All British shipping which has hitherto been using the Mediterranean as its road to the Far East was ordered today to take the longer route around Africa on account of the threatening attitude of Italy, as manifested by the recent declarations of Italian leaders, the constant press campaign, and the unwillingness to resume trade negotiations with England. The British statement said it was hoped that this precaution about the shipping could later be abandoned, but there doesn't seem to be much ground for optimism in the present Italian attitude. The newspaper attacks on both France and England continue, and some people think the decision may be made at a cabinet meeting, which Mussolini has called for tomorrow. The first of Italy's new 35,000-ton battleships, the Vittorio Veneto, mounting 9 15-inch guns, went into service today, and a second will soon be ready. Russia is getting ready to celebrate May Day, and in anticipation, the Communist International has issued a manifesto which criticizes every great power in the world except Germany. The Communists insist that Germany invaded Scandinavia only to counteract Allied violation of Norwegian neutrality, and they throw all the blame on what they call the Anglo-French incendiaries of war. And the American bourgeoisie, according to the Communists, are stretching out their hands to Greenland, Iceland, and the West Indies.
This is the Columbia Broadcasting System.
8:55 p.m. Eastern Daylight Saving Time. The Columbia Broadcasting System and its affiliated stations present the nightly broadcast of Elmer Davis and the news.
After the withdrawal of British forces from southern Norway, the Germans are continuing the mopping up of such Norwegian detachments as are still in the field. The small force that occupied Røros yesterday morning fell back today, as German bombers attacked it and reinforced German troops moved back into the Öster Valley. And it seems unlikely that Norwegian resistance south of Trondheim can continue much longer. Along with their other successes today, the Germans finally opened the railroad from Oslo to Bergen after fighting their way through a tunnel 3 miles long. Of the various reports as to the whereabouts of King Haakon and the Norwegian government, the most probable is the statement of a Norwegian spokesman in Stockholm that they sailed from Molde, presumably with the last of the British forces, for some point in northern Norway. This and the fact that the British troops who got out of Andalsnes were apparently transferred to the Namsos area bears out the British statement that the Norwegian campaign now enters a new phase, presumably a closing in on Narvik and perhaps an attack on Trondheim from the north. Now that the Germans will be able to push in steady streams of reinforcements, the chances of success in such an operation do not seem too bright. And it is a little difficult to see how Mr. Chamberlain could tell the House of Commons today that he was satisfied that the balance of advantage up to the present lies with the Allies, or how a subsequent British statement could say that the objective of the first phase of the campaign had been attained. The German losses were undoubtedly heavy, both in warships and in men drowned in torpedoed transports or killed and wounded in land operations. But the British objective was presumably to keep them from establishing themselves in southern Norway, and from that point of view, the campaign was a total failure. Mr. Chamberlain said that the British battle fleet had put out to sea on Sunday, April 7th, after receiving information that large German naval forces were coming out, but he failed to explain why the British, with their great naval superiority, were unable to prevent the German landings at half a dozen points on Tuesday the 9th. Neutral experts feel there must have been a very poor cooperation between British air and naval forces to permit the Germans to get the jump on them. Once the Germans had occupied the Norwegian ports at first in very light force, they might still have been driven out the first day or two by resolute naval action if the British had been willing to risk the loss of some of their capital ships, in which at present they have a superiority of 14-2. But they risked only one at Narvik, not the most important point. It may be that the first German air attack on the British fleet on Tuesday the 9th inflicted a great deal more damage than the British have admitted. Mr. Chamberlain today, acknowledging the loss of only a few small vessels, said that 5 warships had been damaged. He didn't say what kind of warships or how badly damaged. But at any rate that day, Tuesday, April 9th, seems to have been the best chance the British had to stop the German invasion, and they failed to do it. That was also the day in which British submarines, perhaps supported by destroyers, sank several German transports in the Kattegat. But after that, the Germans got their air bases established on both sides of the straits and managed to get a continual stream of reinforcements through. Not apparently without heavy losses, but they were willing to incur losses of both ships and men to gain an important strategic advantage, which the Allies do not seem to have been. One reason why the Allies were so cautious about risking their capital ships is suggested by the passage in Mr. Chamberlain's statement in the House of Commons that the German naval losses had now made it possible to transfer some Allied naval forces to the Mediterranean, and that an Anglo-French battle fleet is on its way to Alexandria. This is evidence of the apprehension stirred up by the recent Italian press attacks on the Allies and of the many signs indicating that Italy was about to go into the war. Mussolini hasn't gone in yet, but if his activity made the Allies unwilling to take the chances they would have had to take to stop Hitler in Norway while there was still time, Italy has rendered a very valuable service to her Axis ally. Reports from Belgrade tonight said that Italy had expressed disapproval of recent Yugoslav defense measures. And while this is unconfirmed, it may hint at a possible Axis offensive in the Balkans and may explain the peculiar broadcast of the British radio to Romania, declaring that the Allies had great armies in the Near East and would be able to smash any Balkan adventure that Hitler might undertake. Mr. Chamberlain referred to the suspicion of the Allied general staffs that the Norwegian campaign was only a diversion to distract Allied forces while the Germans struck elsewhere. But the Nazis have been able to capitalize on their successes.
This is the Columbia Broadcasting System.
8:55 Eastern Daylight Time. And Columbia and its affiliated stations bring you Elmer Davis and the news.
Unusual precautions are being taken in the Netherlands tonight. All canal locks in the vicinity of Amsterdam have been closed. The Dutch radio has been shut down by government order. Outgoing telephone and teletype communications have been shut off. And any large gatherings of civilians have been prohibited in the frontier districts by the military authorities. A day or two ago, it was rumored that this would be the critical day in this latest invasion crisis, and apparently the Dutch government is taking no chances. But there is as yet no confirmation of the reports of German troop movements that have been current for the last 2 days, and stories that the German army has taken over the railroads for the weekend have been denied in Berlin, though it's admitted that there has been some limitation on ticket sales. In England, Parliament has gone off for a 12-day recess, leaving Mr. Chamberlain to see if he can reconstruct his cabinet more satisfactorily. Endeavors seem to have been made to bring the Laborites and Liberals into a coalition government, but they are said to have refused to share the responsibility, at least under Mr. Chamberlain. A meeting of the Labour Party Executive Committee tomorrow may decide whether the party would join a coalition under some other leader, most probably Lord Halifax. The French Chamber of Deputies is also in recess till a week from today, and Paris reports say that the Reynaud ministry has been much less seriously shaken by the Norwegian failure than has the British cabinet, and will probably carry on without much difficulty. A good deal may depend, however, on whether the Allies are able to take Narvik and hold enough of the northern part of the country for the Norwegian king and government to retain a foothold. The Norwegian Foreign Minister Koht is in Paris, and today urgently appealed for the sending of more troops, though the Allies already seem to have a considerable preponderance of numbers on that front. The Germans claim that their planes sank a large transport off Narvik today and cooperated with land forces in an attack on Allied positions. But a United Press dispatch from just across the Swedish frontier says that 2 Allied columns are converging on German positions east of the town, and that British planes and warships keep the garrison under fire every day. Hitler today ordered the release of all Norwegian prisoners of war except professional soldiers, which apparently means that militia and reservists are allowed to go free. For one of the reasons given was that the Norwegian civil population had not participated in the fighting. In general, Hitler said the Norwegians had fought openly and honorably. As he alleged, the Poles had not. Mussolini didn't make his expected speech today in awarding medals for bravery in Ethiopia and Spain to the survivors of soldiers who were killed there. To the cheering crowds, he said nothing except, I quote, "You must accustom yourselves to my silence. Only events will break it," end quote. The Italian papers continue to be full of bellicose talk, but no action has yet followed it, and it begins to look as if Italian policy may be largely guided by uncertainty as to what Russia is going to do. This seems to be the opinion in the Balkans anyway, where dispatches from Budapest say it is now believed that neither Italy nor Germany will move, in that direction anyway, till it is known what Russia will do. This is a singular reversal of the situation a few weeks ago, when there was fear of Russian aggression in the Balkans, and what kept the region quiet and peaceful then was largely the influence of Italy. Now Italian policy seems to have created such uneasiness that the Balkans are actually feeling more cheerful because it is reported that Russian troops are massed on the frontier of Bessarabia. Probably the Romanians are not very happy about that, but the story, whether true or false, has caused a good deal of satisfaction in the other Balkan states, particularly in Yugoslavia. The Yugoslav trade delegation, which has agreed on the outline of a commercial treaty with Russia but has not finished the transaction yet, is still in Moscow, and Balkan capitals believe that it may be functioning in effect as a diplomatic delegation. However, this belief in the Balkans that the Russians are following a firm and aggressive policy there is repudiated in a dispatch tonight from Moscow, where the official news agency TASS said that Russia has repudiated the old Tsarist policy of pan-Slavism, and it is denied that the Soviet Union is encouraging Romania to help Yugoslavia if the latter state should be attacked by Italy. An order was announced today by the Russian government which stripped power from the political commissars who have hitherto had great authority in the Army and Navy. From now on, the generals and admirals are to be entirely responsible for their command. Political implications of foreign affairs do not seem to have affected this decision. It seems more probable that, as the Russian papers say, it reflects experience gained in fighting against Finns and Japanese.
This is the Columbia Broadcasting System.
Mijn volk, nadat ons land met angstvallige nauwgezetheid al deze maanden een stipte neutraliteit had in acht genomen, en terwijl het geen ander voornemen had dan deze houding streng en consequent vol te houden, is in de afgelopen nacht door de Duitse Weermacht zonder de minste waarschuwing een plotselinge aanval op ons gebied gedaan.
8:55 Eastern Daylight Time and Elmer Davis in the news, brought you tonight by the Gillette Safety Razor Company. Just time to tell you that today's improved Gillette Blue Blade, made of steel hard enough to cut glass, has the sharpest edges ever produced. That's why it gives you the quickest, easiest shaves ever. Ask your dealer for Gillette Blue Blade.
The first day of the German Blitzkrieg against the Low Countries seems to have met with only very moderate success. Both Dutch and Belgians are resisting fiercely, and the Belgians have already been reinforced by strong mechanized columns of British and French troops from the Western Front, responding to the call for help sent out by both small nations after they were invaded. The Dutch and Belgian high commands tonight flatly say the invasion has failed. German advance has been greatest where Holland and Belgium meet. They took the Dutch city of Maastricht, swarmed across the projecting tip of Dutch territory, and say they have taken some bridges on the Albert Canal in northern Belgium. Farther south, they claim to have occupied the town of Malmedy, lost to Belgium by the Treaty of Versailles. Attacks on France and Belgium through Luxembourg have been stopped so far at the frontier. The invasion of the Netherlands seems to have been held at the IJssel River, where the town of Arnhem has resisted German attacks. And many, if not most, of the parachute troops dropped all over Holland before dawn this morning have been mopped up by squads of Dutch machine gunners traveling in fast automobiles. The German claim this morning that the Dutch capital, The Hague, had been captured by troops landed on the beach was not correct. Dutch troops and warships repulsed them. Parachute troops dropped a few miles from Queen Wilhelmina's palace with the apparent intention of seizing the Dutch sovereign were stopped, our correspondent Edwin Hartrich reported in an earlier broadcast, by Dutch soldiers who fought them off in the tulip fields. Around Amsterdam, too, the parachute invaders seem to have been beaten off, but there is still fierce fighting going on in the streets of Rotterdam, the chief Dutch port. The German invasion was preceded by swarms of air raiders who attacked first, following the precedent set in Poland, Dutch and Belgian airfields, and also bombed far and wide over France. More than 20 French cities, ranging from Dunkirk and Calais on the Channel to Lyon in the south, were raided, and while apparently here too airfields, or in some cases radio transmitters, were the primary objective, the French government said that more than 50 civilians were killed. Raids on Paris and on the mouth of the Thames seem to have been purely for reconnaissance, but incendiary bombs were dropped on a town in southeastern England. A raid on Brussels early this morning burned several apartment houses and killed civilians. But after a Belgian protest that Brussels was an open town without troops, the Germans promised not to attack it if it remained so. A late dispatch from The Hague says that no attacks seem yet to have occurred in Holland on non-military objectives. This afternoon, however, the Germans claimed that the German city of Freiburg im Breisgau, also an open town, had been bombed and 24 civilians killed, and each side warns of reprisals if the other doesn't stop it. An air raid alarm was reported from Paris about an hour ago. And all over England, people have been warned to be on guard tonight against parachute troops dropping during the blackout. The only bombs dropped on Switzerland appear to have been a mistake, but the Swiss are conducting a general mobilization nonetheless. And just before all this began, the British announced that they had occupied Iceland, so far as we know, without protest, to prevent its seizure by Germany. Winston Churchill has replaced Neville Chamberlain as British Prime Minister and will form a coalition cabinet. Its membership has not yet been announced, but Chamberlain will stay in it somewhere. Resigning, Chamberlain said that new and drastic action must be taken to restore confidence. The French Premier Reynaud took into his cabinet the prominent extreme conservatives Louis Marin and Jean Barnegaray. Italy is still quiet, and a broadcast on the Rome radio this evening says that it was the blockade more than anything else which prompted Germany to carry the war into new regions where little resistance was expected. This is in flat contradiction of the reasons given by the Nazi leaders for the invasion. Ribbentrop's claim that occupation of the Low Countries anticipated by only a day an Allied attack on Germany with Dutch and Belgian consent, and Goebbels' argument that the Dutch and Belgian governments had plotted a revolution in Germany. And that's the news to this moment.